Welcome to the Helping Families Be Happy podcast, where we explore the often messy world of family, love, and relationships. I am your host for this podcast, Dr. Carla Marie Manly, a practicing clinical psychologist, wellness advocate, and author based in Sonoma County, California. I've teamed up with Familius Publishing to bring you nourishing, real life information about love, family, relationships, and life. Now I'm thrilled to introduce today's fabulous guest, John Schlimm, who will be talking with us about his book, What Would Gen Z Do? Welcome to the podcast, John.
It is so great to be back with you, Dr. Carla. This is going to be fun.
It is always a delight to see you. So, even though we've had a chat before, let's tell our listeners a little bit about what makes you, you.
That is a big question. I think what really makes me, and really what makes so many of us who we are, is the interests that we take and the passions that we have. And certainly over the last several years, my passions and my advocacy work has become focused on Generation Z and the next generation coming after them, as well as mental health. So I have really found my focus and so much of what makes me in those two causes.
So you say you're an advocate.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what you mean.
I love that question because I think that terms like activist and advocate get thrown around so much and by so many people. For me, what an advocate means, or what being an advocate means to me, is to really stand up for a cause, whatever that is. In my case, mental health, young people, but it's so much more than just saying I'm a mental health advocate or I'm a Gen Z advocate. I really think it means we need to be a student of whatever that cause is. And so wherever I'm traveling across the country or right here at home in Pennsylvania, I am continually trying to learn as much as I can about the young people and what's going on with them day to day. Mental health and what's going on there. I love sitting down with experts, and I love sitting down with people who are going through mental health challenges and having discussions with them. I think we've gotten to this point, especially with social media, and I think there's so many good things about social media, but people will say that they're a mental health advocate, and really pretty much all they do every day is post cliche quotes. So they feed into that term of toxic positivity. And okay, anyone can call themselves anything they want, but I think there's a point where we need to move beyond the cliches and actually address the people we are hoping to help.
So what does that look like to you then, to be an advocate other than the book that we're going to dive into? Tell me a little bit about your work as an advocate, boots on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, for me, it is really talking to people and listening to their stories and listening to their experiences. So, for example, during the last several years, when my focus has really sharpened to mental health in young people, anytime I've traveled across the country for whatever reason, whether it's been on book tour, whether it's been an art installation, or I'm invited to do a speech of some kind, I always say to whoever is organizing my trip, certainly I'm glad to be invited to do what you've asked me to come to do, but while I'm in your town or city, please find me a group of young people, a group of Gen Zers to sit down with, and mental health experts. And by making that request, I have gotten to sit down with thousands of young people across the country. And I've also gotten to sit down with mental health experts at every level, whether it is a school psychologist or some of the top mental health officials in a state. And I'm always so grateful for that time because I go in as a student, I go in with curiosity and with questions, and I sit there and I ask them what they are seeing day to day. And I listen and I ask follow-up questions. And I don't have the greatest memory. So, and I don't take notes because I really want to be present. Because if I'm taking notes, I probably wouldn't even be hearing what they were saying to me. So I always consider it a great success when I walk away from those interactions, just really with one or two main points that have stuck in my head, which just adds to the overall knowledge that I have. And different people have said, well, why didn't you go to school for psychology, or why don't you go back to school for psychology? And look, I have the greatest respect for everyone who does. I probably would flunk those classes. All those big words and those tests, and I can't imagine. So I'm glad there are people who are doing that, and I love sitting down with them. But that's why I am very aware that as an advocate, I don't have fancy letters after my name or a ton of degrees, and that's okay, because I have a role that I've carved out, that I think can be helpful to everyone else who is engaged in these issues as well.
And thank you for that background, and I'm a huge believer that we are not the initials after our names, because that's just how many books you've read, how much work have you done in that area, that it really matters how much work we're doing in the world with or
Yes.
without those initials. And we can have lots of initials after our name, but if we're not a force of good in the world, why bother? But anyway.
100%. 100%. Yes.
Why yes, exactly. Why bother? Because it's our actions that matter, and it's interesting because sometimes you meet a doctor, PhD, MD, or whatever, and they have no bedside manner and no ability to relate to people, to truly help people in the way they need to be helped, and sometimes they're doing harm in the world because
Yes.
and I have so many clients who have told me very sad stories about being in a hospital setting and the doctor or clinic setting, wherever their own doc, and the doctor's not hearing them, is not listening to them, and is making their situation worse because they are not present. And so I think that's a gift you clearly have. Let's forget the initials. It's about the fact you have presence, you have drive, and you had dedication to your cause. And that's not something we can learn in a book. That's a gift you have from your soul.
Yes, and there's absolutely no substitute for sitting down with, let's say, a group of ninth graders and just asking them, what is it like to be in ninth grade? And just letting the conversation go from there, because they will certainly tell you everything and more that you could have hoped you would hear, or maybe not hoped you would hear, because a lot of it is difficult, but it so informs you and the work that you have to do. Likewise, sitting down with, say, a group of individuals who are in a psychiatric facility, but also involved in the criminal justice system, for whatever reason, they've broken the law and there's lots of issues going on. I've sat down with those adults and had really great discussions and listened to them. And in fact, one of the most valuable lessons when we talk about, because I really, the instance I'll tell you about is really why I have started paying more attention to how many cliches are just constantly posted. I was sitting down with a group of men who are currently in some aspect of or involved in the criminal justice system, but they also have mental health issues. So they were at this facility, and the word hope came up, which is a beautiful word. An absolutely beautiful word. But I said to these men, who were all ages from 18 to someone in their 60s, I said, what does the word hope mean to you? And this man, probably in his 30s, without hesitation said, it's a trigger for me.
Mm.
And this was such an amazing moment. And I said, really? I said, tell me more about that. And he said, people keep throwing that word at me. Like, there's always hope. Oh, there's hope for you. There's hope. And he said, to the point where it's become meaningless. And I just thought that was such an amazing insight. And, this is the reason I want to sit down with the people who are actually going through it. I don't want to just assume I know what's going on, because what that interaction and the other men started shaking their heads. They agreed. So it really made me think about different posts that I'll do, and making sure that I'm not even accidentally virtue signaling or throwing these phrases out there that really, at the end of the day, what do they mean, especially if you're just hearing them all the time? So, and that's just one tiny example, but it just shows that when you sit down with the individuals, you're going to learn so much more than you could from a textbook or anyone else.
Absolutely, and it's also making me really appreciate the part you're talking about that is focused on mindfulness. That when you're
Yeah,
communicating, you bring one of my favorite skills, you bring curiosity. And that's
yeah.
you're talking, and we learn so much when we actually ask questions rather than assuming. But you also have a really beautiful way of being mindful about how you're communicating, how you're interacting, and I think as we pivot to talking about the book, that those skills when we're working with anybody, but particularly Gen Z, being curious and being mindful in our communications with them can go a long way. So you're the expert here. Let's dive into talking about what would Gen Z do? And maybe we can explore some of the tips that we can learn to help, teens, tweens, Gen Zers face the many challenges that are present today. Especially when we're looking at this is a very, big back to school time. And
Yes.
even going back to school can be so triggering for many Gen Zers. So you're the expert. Guide us.
Well, I think to your point of helping them to face the many challenges, I think we need to just sort of rephrase that a little bit because they, as a generation, and we can never forget they're also individuals. So even though we talk of them as a generation, we also have to remember, I even have to remind myself, we're talking about millions of individuals here who have
Hmm.
their own personalities and everything that go just like the rest of us. But in terms of facing challenges, they're already facing the challenges, and I think we often think like, okay, what are the tools we can give them to help them face it? We have to kind of again rephrase that and think about what are the tools we as the older adults in the room need to have to help them to further face the challenges, because they're already facing them, they're well aware, they're so mindful and so aware. I don't know that there's ever been a generation this young that has been so self-aware.
I
They,
agree.
they know what those challenges are in front of them. And I think therein lies the challenge for the rest of us, because that wasn't the case when we were their age. And so we're not always quite sure what to do with that.
So you're right. Sometimes it is our anxiety, our ineptness sometimes that really gets in the way. So, and that's a big word, inept, but in truth, there are times that adults cannot know what to do with a generation that is so unique and so very different in many ways. Of course, we all are alike in many ways, but often between generations, there are some significant differences. How would you coach adults who are, whether it's the kid next door, your own child, or, a child in the classroom, how would you coach them to support Gen Zers' emotional needs?
Well, I think one of the first things I would do in talking to adults, and I do this when I do talk to groups of adults about Gen Z, I would suggest that they check in with their own triggers. Because we talk so much like, oh, these young kids are constantly triggered and unhinged, and I sort of flip that on its head and say, are they the ones triggered, or are we? Are we initially triggered, which maybe leads to them being triggered? And the thing is, it's not a criticism. We're all in this together. So there's no judgment here. But one of the things I've learned in both talking to Gen Zers, but also observing my colleagues at the university where I taught, as well as adults in groups that I'm in when they're asking me all sorts of questions. And I've realized that a lot of times it's the adult who is triggered. Uh, More than likely because of something they went through when they were younger. So there's a trauma there that maybe they haven't gotten the help that they really need and deserve, or they're in the process of getting that help. And suddenly they run up against, this young person who is so open and so courageous in sharing their struggles, whether it's mental health or gender or anything else. And I think sometimes it's triggering because when we were their age, we weren't allowed to talk about, in fact, in the 80s, I don't think I ever heard, when I was their age, I don't think I even heard the word anxiety uh, ever mentioned. Depression, maybe a little bit. I probably didn't even really know what it was. Suicide, it was very hush hush. And maybe you didn't even hear about it. So I think, and I've told Gen Zers this as well. I'm like, look, because I would hear them talking about their parents in my classroom, and there are so many great parents out there, and grandparents and guardians, but I would also hear about the ones who are a little more challenging as parents, and they would use words like judgmental and closed-minded and homophobic and words like that. And then it occurred to me one day, for the first time in my teaching career, I'm like, oh my goodness, their parents are my age. They're Gen Xers like me. Because, when you start out teaching, you're kind of like the older brother, sister age. And then maybe it's like uncle and aunt. You sort of go through these phases in terms of who your students are. And suddenly it dawned on me who these parents they were talking about. I'm like, okay, if I had kids, which I don't, they'd be this age. And so what that did is it allowed me to, so not only did they give me a front seat to their generation, but they also opened a window back into my own generation. And I was able to sit down with these Zers and say, okay, now that I understand generally that your parents are Gen Xers or around my age, let me tell you that we went through a lot of the same things you're going through right now, but we weren't allowed to talk about them at home, school, church, in the community. You just weren't able to talk about them the way you can now. So for a lot of your parents, I think they went through these things and had to be quiet, but now they have you all who are so wonderfully open and talking about that. And I think sometimes they just don't know what to do with that. And sure, it's certainly not an excuse, but I think it's an invitation for maybe you as the younger person to reach out your hand and just show that you understand that maybe this is difficult for them for reasons that you didn't realize before.
And I love that piece, John, and I agree so many times. It's the adult in the room who the chronological age, they're 40, 50, 60, however old they are, but their emotional experience in the world, their
Yeah.
emotional intelligence can be, and again, no judgment, it can be quite often stunted. Again, because they didn't grow up in a space where we even understood emotional intelligence. And if you don't work on it, if you don't grow it, it's not going to be there. And some people who purport to have emotional intelligence don't really when it comes down to intimate relationships. And I 100% agree with you that so often it's the adult being triggered, whether it's by seeing a school shooting and they get, or, even in the news, or anxiety about global warming, or anxiety about their financial future, whatever it is, and all of those things that aren't processed, that aren't talked about, that aren't explored in their own self or in their own, let's say, romantic relationships, then gets displaced onto the child. And oh, the child is anxious, the child is suffering. Well, maybe sometimes, as you say, and I really want to honor that because it's so true, that sometimes we need to really do our work as adults. We need to do our work as parents, as grandparents, as teachers, as caregivers, so that we aren't projecting our unresolved issues on kids, because I'm a firm believer, as clearly you are, that if we've suffered any form of trauma, whether in the past or and current life can be, not to overuse the word trauma, but current life, there's a lot of trauma-inducing stimuli in it everywhere, that if we're not doing our work on an ongoing level, we often will unconsciously take it out on the person proximate to us, and that's often a child.
Yeah.
So I love that that is one of your biggest tips. Parents, adults, no blame, no shame. Do your work, do your self-reflection, do your journaling, do your meditation, be as mindful as you can, and that is one of the best ways, if I'm hearing you, to support Gen Z.
Yes, and also, depending on the child's age, be open with them about how you are feeling, right? So if they're talking about having anxiety and depression, even suicidal ideation, um, you can be, and as much as you're comfortable with, but say to them, I'm not really comfortable talking about this because when I was your age, we weren't allowed to talk about it. Even if that's all you can say in that moment, that's
Mhm.
already a step in the discussion that you can then further pursue with them. But I'll tell you what: the more open you can be with young people, the more they are going to respect and respond to you. When I am with groups of all ages, but especially young people, and I very openly share with them that I have had, at this point, a 51-year journey with anxiety, and I talk a little bit about that. I just see like their eyes grow wide and they just light up. So it doesn't matter how many books I've written or what museums I've been in or any of this other stuff I've done. It just becomes one human being to another. And when that
Yes.
happens, it's the most wonderful and incredible thing, because it's that point of connection where the roles of teacher and student continually are reversing and going back and forth. And I always say that I truly believe I have learned more from the Gen Zers than they could ever learn from me. Hopefully, they've learned something from me. But with every interaction, I learn so much, not only about them, but about myself.
Absolutely, John, and I agree with you when we don't come from a top-down approach with kids, and we come from, "I'm a person, you're a person. I might not get your experience, but here is a common piece. Here is where I get you. I feel anxious too." And I wanna just take a hop almost backwards in our conversation where you talked about sharing your experience if a kid is unloading to you, sharing with you, "Hey, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling, suicidal," that we want to be really careful that when we share and open up with them, even about our not knowing or our discomfort, that we also want to take great care to not unload our trauma onto them, anything that's unresolved or unprocessed. So that is not, listeners, we are not saying that this is the opportunity to say, well, let's make this about me. When I was 25, I was this XXX happened to me. That's not what we are talking about here. We are talking about finding a common ground that allows the child to come toward you. If you, as the adult, need someone to process things with, the child is not the right person for that. Would you agree, John?
100%. Yes. Yes. They are not our therapist and we are not theirs.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's a really huge piece that many, again, no blame, no shame, that many parents mistake the Gen Zers in their lives for friends. And especially in our world where so many parents are isolated and don't have resources, they often naturally turn to their children as friends. And I think that is a big stressor for Gen Zers when a parent explicitly or implicitly puts a child in the place of being the friend or sometimes even the parent in the relationship.
Yes, and especially since I have found that Gen Zers are so sentimental, they are so compassionate, they're great listeners, and if you engage them in conversation, they're great conversationalists. But to your point, if you're unloading, the sponge that they are can only take so much. And so I do think that it's part of our growth in self-awareness as adults, to not do that oversharing. And that's certainly why I said really depending on, the age of the Gen Zer. But, I think self-awareness is so important here. And for Gen Zers, the majority of them have so much self-awareness already that sometimes we feel like we have to catch up to that. And so we really have to work on that ourselves.
Absolutely, and thanks for highlighting that because I think that that lack of self-awareness that many adults have, it's okay to be honest about that. It is really okay, and then the next step is to do the work, and the work is a lifetime. Our Gen Xers are growing up in schools that promote self-awareness with TikToks, with all of these things that promote, ideally, in the best of cases, self-awareness. And so it's okay for us to say, I don't have it, but I'm working on it. I'm not there, but I'm working on it. And I think, again, that's a way we can support the Gen Zers and anyone in our lives by saying, I might not have all the answers, but I'm working on it. And then to really do that work. So going back to your book, would you please give us, as any listener, give us some insights from your book that might help support not just families and helping families be more happy, more happier and more joyful. What are some tips in there that can help us be generally more joyful with our interactions with Gen Zers?
Well, so the main audience that I wrote What Would Gen Z Do For is the older adults. Certainly, the book is dedicated to Gen Z. It is my love letter to a generation. The book is comprised of all the things over the past several years that Gen Zers across the country have asked me to share with the rest of the world about them. So I'm very much a messenger for them here and very humbled to be so. I wanted to put this book in the hands of parents and teachers and grandparents and employers and all those individuals who are interacting in some way with Gen Z so that they could just gain a little bit better of an understanding. Because I think Gen Z, even though they're now, they range from age 11 to 26, they still remain a great mystery, right? And maybe
Hmm.
every generation within that age span and that point in their ages is a mystery. But the really main point, so main that I become like a broken record, is to talk to them. And it sounds so simple, but so few adults take that step in just talking to them. So if you want to know something about Gen Z, if you want to know what that tattoo means, that might look strange to you, or why their hair is blue or purple, why they have that piercing, why they play video games all the time, I certainly can share with you what I know in my book, but there is no substitute like going and asking that Gen Zer. And so I really hope, if nothing else, that this book encourages more interaction
Hmm.
between older generations and Gen Zers. And really, to that point, the biggest thing I hear from older generations is, well, they don't talk, or they're introverted, or they're weird, or all these stereotypes. And the thing is, I get why they're saying what they're saying. And guess what? I've brought those observations back to groups of Gen Zers and said, this is what I'm hearing about all of you. And even though I know that that isn't completely true, why do you think people are assuming these things about you? And what they will tell me is, a lot of us have social anxiety. So we're very hesitant to engage in groups. And certainly anyone who's listening to our interview, even these last few minutes, knows what kind of classroom I have. It's very laid back. It's very open. I'm not teaching chemistry, so I don't have to worry about things going boom. So I can be a little bit more laid back. When I've asked that question about social anxiety, because when the term was first put on my radar, I'm like, what does that even mean? They said, John, what that means is even in your class, there are a lot of us who would not walk across the back of the room to throw something out in the garbage can because we'd be afraid someone would turn and we would feel judgment from them,
Mm.
whether it's real or perceived. So I'm like, okay. The other response and that made sense. I'm like, okay, now I get why sometimes you'll come into a room that's crowded and you'll go to the corner and your head's down in a book or, on your phone. The other response I've gotten to why do people think this about you is that because we live right now in such a politically divisive culture, divisive in so many ways, not even just politically, but in so many ways, a lot of Gen Zers are afraid, they have told me, to be the first ones to speak up because they are so afraid that even accidentally, they're going to say the wrong thing and anger someone. And
I I
I
agree
love
with you.
that insight. I love that insight. And I would have never known that had I not asked directly the source. And so I can now take that back to groups of adults and say, it's not about being introverted. It's not about being weird. And guess what? Being weird can be cool. So, I proudly wear that moniker.
Yes.
But I'm like, this is why sometimes you as the adult need to be the first one to go up and start the conversation. And I said, I've done this many times myself. And I guarantee if you take that first step, I've had conversations that have gone on 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, more about everything and anything you can imagine. Wonderful, fabulous conversations. But sometimes you've got to be the one to make that first step.
And thank you for both of those very important points, and I can echo their truth. I know when I work with Gen Zers, both of those things are definitely present. The part of the fear of judgment, which is of course linked to the other piece, which in our very, politically correct, societally correct world where there's a lot of rights, wrongs, goods, bads, kids feel, and we often all feel a little bit at the mercy of being politically correct, and that
Yeah.
political correctness, social correctness is a moving target. And so
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of withholding simply out of fear so that somebody doesn't get, and I hear Gen Zers talk about it all the time. They don't want to be dubbed as being anti-woke, anti-this, anti-that. And so living in a place of fear, it's a difficult place to be. So let's hope we get some softening in that world very soon because it's a very bad tightrope for everyone.
Well, one of the best decisions I ever made as an educator from the very beginning, I decided that I would never bring my politics or my political opinions into the classroom. And to this day, even my closest friends and family have no idea how I vote. What this has allowed is it has allowed my students to be very comfortable in sharing their
Hmm.
opinions. And most classes I have, it's 50-50 and a few in the middle in terms of the political spectrum. They have had wonderful discussions. There hasn't been screaming and carrying on and people storming out of the room. Someone will express their opinion, someone will say they agree or disagree, but wonderful discussions. And in recent years, I have had young people come up to me and say, we so appreciate that we have no idea where you stand on any of this because it's
Absolutely.
allowed us to be comfortable coming in. And believe me, I have asked them, and the question is not even out of my mouth, and the hands are going up, like how some of their other teachers and professors are. And I've heard absolute horror stories of being, shamed by teachers in class because the student has differing opinions, grades suffering, and it angers me so much. And maybe these teachers that are doing that don't even realize what they're doing or just the pain and the anguish that they're inflicting, and really just the toxicity that they're bringing into their classroom. So, for all of the teachers out there, I love you. I know there are so many more good ones than the ones who maybe should find something else to do. And I will always have your back. But, what I have found is, allow them to have the discussions, but you don't need to insert your opinions in there, at least not if it's going to be to their detriment.
Another area where we are completely aligned, politics, it's a very private matter. We're entitled to our opinion, and so are all of the students in the world, all the people in the world, and until we learn how to make that space for everyone else's opinions and allow them to people have their opinions, and we need to do that for the younger generation as well, to allow them to form their own opinions without being judged. I 100% have your back on that. 100% agree. Absolutely. There are many places in life where our political opinions are just best kept to ourselves, and however we want to support that in a positive way. So, moving on, our last topic, I could go into this with you for hours. I know I like you so much and I like your message so much. What are some red flags that we would want to pay attention to that indicate that a child is in some form of distress? What are some of those big markers we want to have our eyes and ears out for?
Well, it'll come as no surprise based on our conversation that I've actually asked Gen Zers some variation of this exact same question. And what they have told me is a lot of times they are expressing to the adult, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, whoever, that they're having feelings of suicidal ideation, or that they are, having an anxiety attack or a panic attack, or, fill in the blank, and they're dismissed. So when we talk about red flags, which is a term that I think becomes a little bit cliche, and we throw around, oh, the red flags for this, the red flags for that. What I would say is the Zers are waving. If they have a red flag, they're waving it right in front of our faces. And I've had students tell me, when I've expressed even feelings of suicidal ideation, my parents will be like, oh, just go upstairs and get a good night's sleep.
Oh
You
my
know,
goodness.
and my jaw just
Oh my
drops to the floor.
goodness.
And and I'll say, repeat that one more time for me. So I'm sure that I heard that correctly, and they will. Now that is certainly an extreme case
Mhm.
and a really disturbing case, but I hear so many comments like that. And I think part of the reasoning for that is because there are so many stereotypes uh, that are perpetuated about young people. They're lazy. Oh, they're always whining. They're snowflake. Again, fill in the blank. We've all heard these, that I think it's so easy for us adults to just buy into those, even if it's our children or our students thinking, oh, you're just whining. You're just whining that you have anxiety or that this or that. And we have got to, again, check in with ourselves, because when we talk about red flags, they're waving them. There's no mystery there. They're waving them, saying, please listen to me.
Absolutely.
And a lot of adults aren't.
And that's the part, as we wrap up, I think one of the greatest gifts we can give to anyone in our lives, but certainly to children, the ones we're responsible for,
Yes.
caring for them, is your time, your
Yes.
attention, tuning in, while you're making dinner, while you're having dinner, put away the cell phone, sit down at a table, and allow even for quiet. You can ask some questions, but
Yeah.
also quiet. Give kids the space, and also take the time to pay attention. Don't blame or shame yourself if you haven't been doing it in the past, but
Yeah.
now you can do new things to say, hey, I see you. I'm here for you. You matter. And isn't that what we all really want, is to have somebody across from us say, hey, I'm here for you. You matter. Let me
Yeah.
be a
And
safe space.
and I would even recommend, what you said was just so beautiful just now. I think it really starts with us adults looking in the mirror and saying those words to ourselves,
Mhm.
because we really need to be present for ourselves. It's talking about cliches, as much as I don't like them, some of them do stand the test of time. Like on the airplane, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. We need to take care of ourselves first, or we're not going to be able to take care of anybody else, including young people. So, like I always say, there's no blame, it's no judgment, but we're all in this together, and we have to act like
Yes.
it's a team effort, because it really, really is. And when it comes to mental health, it isn't always about that chronological age of, oh, I'm 30, I'm 40, I'm 50, I should know better. And I hear that all the time, like, oh, I can't believe at age 50 that those numbers mean
It
nothing.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is,
Journey. It's a
yep,
journey.
it's a journey. Do you have the skills? If you don't, work on them no matter what age you
Yeah.
are. It's our privilege and it's also our responsibility to do our work. And just wrapping it up with that piece on self-care, listeners, doesn't mean that self-care is selfish. It means that self-care is about giving yourself time every day, 5 minutes to
Yes.
meditate, to journal, to do your gratitude practice while you're brushing your teeth. If you're like me, you can fit it in when you're sitting in your car, listening to a podcast on mental health or something to uplift you. We can all do better at self-care that doesn't cost a penny and helps us improve our awareness. Right, John? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I always say to everyone, treat yourself to something every single day. And it doesn't have to be big and extravagant. It could be a walk at lunchtime. It could be a hot soak bath, whatever, reading your favorite book, favorite poem. But treat yourself at least once every single day to something that you enjoy. And that's really what it's about.
Brilliant. John, thank you so much for taking your time. Seriously, it's always a joy to commune with you, to hear from you, and to share your huge wisdom with our listeners. Where can our listeners find you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is johnschlimm.com, JOHNSCHLIMM.com. And all of my social media links are there. And so I love connecting with people over social media. And certainly as I travel around the country doing various things, what an amazing opportunity to get to cross paths with all of my neighbors across the country and the globe. So I love it, meeting new people.
Okay, well, thank you. And John's book, What Would Gen Z Do, is available through Familius. And as we conclude today's podcast, I'd like to thank Familius Publishing for their support in bringing this podcast to your ears and your heart. Would be thrilled if you'd subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review on iTunes and social media. If you'd like more wonderful Familius content, such as the amazing book we discussed today, What Would Gen Z Do? Please visit us at familius.com, where you will find our Habit Hub blog as well as a spectacular selection of books for families. One step at a time, we can and will make the world a better and happier place. Thanks for sharing your time with me, Dr. Carla Marie Manly. It's been a joy and a true pleasure. Be well and shine, shine, shine as only you can do.